Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. This is a re-recorded version of my second Sunday live demo for August 2020. I chose the title, What's on Your Palette, for this demo because that's probably one of the most common questions I get from viewers. Or more specifically, would you please list all the colors on your palette? I know this is a common practice for watercolor instructors, but my answer is always, sorry, no, I won't list all the colors on my palette. This isn't because I'm keeping some big secret from you. It's because, first of all, the colors on my palette are always changing. There are always colors there that are only temporarily there for a class that I'm teaching or a project I'm working on, or maybe I'm just testing out a color to see how it works with other colors on my palette. Second, everyone's monitor shows color a bit differently. So I do calibrate my monitor and use color balance lights and adjust my camera's white balance to try to record colors as accurately as possible. But I have no control over how your monitor shows colors, and you might not either. When you're watching a video tutorial, it's important to keep in mind that there's no guarantee that the color that you're seeing on your screen is the same as the color in real life. But the most important reason is that color preferences and even color perception varies enormously from person to person. So in this demo, instead of just giving you a list of colors, I hope to help you understand some factors that you might want to take into account as you choose colors for your palette, and give you a strategy for constructing a palette so that you can find colors that please you and work well together to make color mixing fast and effortless. Now, if you're a complete beginner and you haven't bought supplies yet and you're wondering what on earth to buy, please check out the supply list for my beginner course, Watercolor Jumpstart. Go to dragonflyspiritstudio.com and follow the links to learn, and then self-guided courses to find Watercolor Jumpstart. The 5-color palette that I suggest for Watercolor Jumpstart is going to be our starting point for today's demo. So if you just finished that course, you'll be in great shape. But I know that many of you who are watching this video will have whole drawers or bins or bags full of colors, and you still feel like you can't mix the color that you want. So part of the problem is the notion that you have to find a perfect match for every color that you see in the scene that you want to paint. There are always going to be some colors in nature that we can't match with paint marks on paper. As painters, we use a lot of other things besides exact color matching to create a believable illusion. So start by having realistic expectations for your color mixing. It's not necessary to have a perfect match for everything to have a believable illusion. Often the relationships between colors in the painting are more important than the exact colors. So we're going to start off by talking about the idea of a limited palette. A limited palette is maybe 3 to 8 or 9 colors that you use to mix everything. And some people take to the idea of a limited palette immediately, and those people probably aren't watching this video. Artists generally don't like to be told you can't use that. I like to think instead of having a base palette. So 3 to 8 colors that you know really, really well and that work well together for most of the colors you need to mix, maybe 90%. And then instead of limiting myself to just those colors, I'm going to add some spice colors to get that last 10 or 20% of the colors that I need for a particular subject or season or location or the decor where the painting will hang. And then I'll allow myself to add my joy colors. These are colors that I just like, or maybe they help me create the mood that I want to create with this painting. So for me, the base palette is about 5 colors, and I have 2 or 3 joy colors that stay on my palette pretty much all the time. They're on any palette I construct. And then I bring in spice colors occasionally, not very often, maybe one in, I don't know, 8 or 10 paintings, something like that. And the rest of the colors on my palette are usually there because of something I'm doing, classes that I'm teaching, or I need them to illustrate a particular point about watercolor properties or something like that, and not because I'm using them in my own paintings. If you watch my demos, you'll see my brush goes back into the same 4 or 5 colors over and over again, which means I don't have to think very hard about mixing color. I know exactly where to go, exactly how much color to use to get the color I want. So I have some of the advantages of a limited palette in terms of I can mix color quickly. My paintings automatically have color harmony. Everything looks like it belongs together instead of being sort of disconnected blobs of color. And my paintings as a group look like they were all painted by the same person. But at the same time, I overcome the disadvantages of a limited palette in that my palette's not limited. If I can't mix something with that base palette, I feel free to bring in another color occasionally. But the strategy for constructing a base palette is different from a limited palette. So let's have a look at the beginnings of a base palette and talk about how do you figure out what colors should go in your base palette. So this is a color wheel exercise that we do in the watercolor jumpstart course. It's project 3 if you want to get the specific details of how to do this exercise, but let me just briefly explain what's going on here. So you probably learned in kindergarten that red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors for paint, and that if you take two primary colors and mix them together, say red and yellow, you get a secondary color, in this case orange. So in this color wheel, we explore mixing the two primaries together to get the secondaries. And then in between a secondary color and a primary color are what are called tertiary colors. The terminology doesn't really matter that much. The important part is the outside part of this ring shows us all the colors that we can mix using two of these three colors. In the center here, or going towards the center, I've taken the color that's in the little triangle here and mixed a little bit of the opposite color. That's the complement of the color. So if you add a little bit of a complement, what happens is you get a color that's moving a little bit towards a neutral, towards a gray or a brown. So we call these colors semi-neutrals or neutralized colors or grayed down colors. And those are very important colors to have in most of the world, in most of what you see around you. The colors are not these bright, pure kindergarten colors. They're a few of these with a lot of these semi-neutral colors. So this color wheel exercise is a way to kind of explore all the two-way combinations and some of the three-way combinations. So everything that's in here is actually a combination of all three colors, because if I take this purple, it already involves the blue and the red, so I've got both of those in here, and then I add the third yellow. If I take red, it's just its own primary, but its complement, green, involves both blue and yellow. So all the colors in the center parts here, or in these petals, are mixtures of all three colors. And then in the center, we just do lighter versions to see what these look like, pale. So that really is back to mixing just two colors. But this is a way of kind of exploring with these three colors, what can I do? And as you can see, we get a pretty nice range of colors out of these three. Maybe not the brightest possible purple or the brightest possible green or the brightest possible orange, but pretty nice. And we know this is only three of the colors that are going to go in our base palette, so we don't have to worry about getting perfection on the outside here. We just want to get a pretty good range of the colors that we use 80 or 90% of the time. So how did I go about choosing this particular red, yellow, and blue as the starting point for my base palette? Well, let's look at another example as a way to kind of understand one thing you might want to think about when you're choosing colors for your base palette. So in this case, I chose a yellow that's quite orangey, and I chose a red that's a little bit on the magenta side, maybe leaning a tiny bit towards blue. So as you can see, when I mix these together, I get kind of a dull orange. That's because I wind up here having red, yellow, and a teeny bit of the bluish tones here, so I have a little bit of all three primaries here. So this is a little bit neutralized. Now, that could be a fine starting point for a base palette for someone who doesn't use very many bright oranges but uses a lot of these colors. So you could say, I'm going to use this as my starting point, and if I happen to need a really bright orange, I'll bring one in from somewhere else. That'll be one of my spice colors. But if you're a beginner or you're just getting started with this base palette idea, you might want to do what I did here and start with a red, yellow, and blue that give you at least reasonably clear secondary colors. So how do I pick a red, yellow, and blue that do that? Because there are lots and lots and lots of possible yellows in watercolor and lots of possible reds and so on. So what I did here was I tried to pick a yellow that is right in the middle of the road. It's not an orangey yellow and it's not a greenish yellow. It's just sort of right in the middle. Now, there are also lots of yellows that are kind of right in the middle. And again, everybody's color perception is a little different. So pick a yellow that for you looks like it's not leaning orangey and it's not leaning greenish. Now, there's lots of different possible choices for reds, yellows, and blues that sort of fall into that category. So how do you choose between them? So one thing that you would want to take into account when you're constructing a base palette is something called tinting strength. And this doesn't get a lot of discussion, so I want to explain what that is and why you want to think about it. But before I do that, I need to say something I should have said earlier. I know some of you probably have your nose up to the screen and you're trying to read all these things I have written here and frantically take notes. So you can just put your pencils down because the handout for this video has close-up photos of all the color wheels that I'm showing. So if you need to go back and see them closer or get the names or whatever, you can find all that in the handout. So for right now, just relax and pay attention to the overall concept. Except for the Jumpstart base palette, all the rest of these are just cobbled together examples anyway, and not necessarily something you'd want to use for your base palette. For your base palette, the best place to start is the pigments that you already find yourself using a lot. That's a good indication that those colors might be colors you're already starting to learn. So start there. Don't jump in and start with whatever I have as just a random example. So tinting strength refers to how much physical quantity of that paint do I have to mix with water to get a wash of a particular strength. So I'm sure you've noticed, I will name some names here. This is phthalo blue, and I'm sure you've noticed if you've been painting at all that when you're using phthalo blue, you can use just a little dab of it and get a nice strong blue wash. Whereas with cobalt blue, the blue over here, you have to use quite a bit more of the paint to get a wash that's the same strength of blue. The reason why you want to worry about tinting strength is that if you don't have a balance in tinting strength, it can make color mixing hard. So let me explain what I mean. If I'm trying to mix a green that's sort of halfway between the yellow and blue, it's not a yellow green and it's not a blue green, it's just a green green. If the two colors have about the same tinting strength, then I need about the same amount of paint to get a green that looks like it's about halfway in between. So because the quantity of paint kind of matches where you fall on this arc, it makes it pretty easy to quickly mix all these colors in between. If you want a blue-green, you know you need a little bit or a lot of blue and a little bit of yellow. If you want a yellow-green, a lot of yellow, a little bit of blue. In the middle, use about the same amount. Over here, these two colors have very different tinting strengths. So this is the same yellow as before, and this is phthalo blue. So if you've used phthalo blue, you know that it's a powerful color. So if I try that same strategy of making two puddles that look like about the same amount of paint and mix them together, I actually wind up with a very dark blue-green. In fact, it's so dark that we have to add a little bit of water even to see really on the video what color we've got here. So it seems like a good idea to buy paint with high tinting strength because you use less paint, right? But in fact, a lot of times you wind up using more paint because you use a little bit of the blue, but then you have to use a ton of yellow to keep up with it. And you accidentally overdo the blue so easily that it makes it really hard and frustrating to land on the exact color that you want in between. So sometimes my students have this little myth that goes around and they say that I hate phthalo blue. And I don't hate phthalo blue. It's just a good example here. I actually love phthalo blue. I'm just saying that if phthalo blue is going to be in your base palette, you either need to have other colors that have equal tinting strength, which is tough for the yellows, which is why phthalo blue isn't on my base palette, or you set up your base palette with a different blue that plays nicer with the other colors, that has a more similar tinting strength. And then if you need phthalo blue, you bring that one in as one of your spice colors or one of your joy colors. So I'm not saying don't use it. I'm saying it might not be the best blue to have as the blue in your base palette. Now, as your base palette grows, you might have multiple blues. You might wind up with both of these blues in your base palette because you find you use them a lot. But let's say you're just starting out and you're going to do kind of the smallest base palette and grow from there. I strongly suggest you try to find 3 colors that have similar tinting strength. That's why I have cobalt blue here instead of phthalo blue. Now, watercolors have other properties that you have probably heard referred to, so let's talk about some of those. So watercolors are commonly separated into granulating or sedimentary colors versus non-granulating or non-sedimentary, staining colors versus non-staining colors, opaque colors versus transparent colors, and of course all of these are really a range, so things are more or less staining, more or less opaque. But the good news about all 3 of these properties is they really don't have a big impact on your ability to learn to mix colors. So with all 3 of these properties, you can kind of go on just your personal preference. What do you like the look of? What do you like the handling properties of? So I'm going to talk about each one and mention some of the things you might want to think about. But for the most part, you can just kind of go with what you like with respect to all 3 of these properties. So I should just say that we could probably do an entire demo about these various properties of watercolors and how to exploit them in your paintings. And this is not that demo. I need to get back to how to construct your base palette. So I'm just going to say enough about them to kind of orient those of you who are new to watercolor, and so you'll understand the terminology, and to point out a few things that you might want to take into consideration as you build your base palette. So sedimentary colors are ones that dry with this sort of speckly appearance that you see on the left, and non-sedimentary colors dry with a smoother look like the one on the right. Staining versus non-staining colors refers to how easily the color can be lifted after it's dried. And as you can see here, you can still lift some of a staining color, just usually not as much as you can lift for a non-staining color. So now let's talk about the distinction between opaque colors and transparent colors. Now, watercolor is considered a transparent medium, but some colors are more transparent than other colors. So for example, here are 2 reds, and you can see that this one here, the Purell red, is a lot more opaque. You can still see it on top of this black bar, whereas this one over here, which is actually a mixture, I'll talk about that in a minute, but this is a mixture of 2 transparent colors, so you can barely see a little bit of the red on top of there, but that's a pretty transparent color. So this again is a matter of personal preference, and I tend to prefer to have my colors be as transparent as possible. So this is one place where I chose not to put this bright sort of fire engine red on my palette, on my base palette. I know I can pull in an opaque red if I need it, but one reason why I don't have it on my palette is this is the Purell red, that's the pretty opaque one, and this is a mixture of the red and yellow on the Watercolor Jumpstart palette. And so I can actually get very close to this color using my transparent watercolors. And then I have the transparency that I like. So this was a consideration for me. I didn't feel like I needed to add this color because I could mix a very close substitute for it. And if I did have a situation where I wanted the more opaque color, then this would come in as one of my spice colors. So this last example is a good illustration of how you might think about which colors need to be in your base palette. I didn't care for how opaque that bright red was, and many of the similar hues, the similar bright reds that I might substitute for it, are also fairly opaque. But I don't need to keep that opaque color in my base palette because I can easily mix it from two other colors that are already in my base palette. And I don't use that sort of a bright fire engine red very often in my paintings, so I don't mind having to mix it occasionally. And I know that if I decide I'm going to do a painting that's going to include a lot of that color and I don't want to have to mix it, then I can easily bring it in as one of my spice colors. So keep in mind, your base palette only has to have you covered 80 to 90% of the time, and then you can bring in special colors if you need to. So how do you know if a color is granulating or non-granulating or staining or non-staining? You really need to look at your manufacturer's charts. Go online and find their color charts, find their little codes that they use. Every one of them does it a little differently, but they all have some indication of which colors are where. There are pigments that tend to fall more into one category than the other, but some of that can be affected by how the paint is formulated. So your first line of information is the manufacturer's charts, and then the most important one, your own swatching and testing. So we have our primary palette that we were using as the start of our base palette for Watercolor Jumpstart. And now you know that I chose primaries that were sort of middle of the road. So this yellow is not an orangey yellow and it's not a greenish yellow, it's just a yellow, and so on for the others. And they have about equal tinting strength. As far as the other properties for Jumpstart, I chose based on things I wanted to illustrate in the class, and you can choose based on personal preference. I want to compare this palette to another palette that's very commonly recommended for beginners and also very commonly recommended as a limited palette, and that's the split primary palette. So the way this one works is instead of 3 colors, I have 6. For each primary, instead of having a color that's sort of a middle-of-the-road yellow here, I have a yellow that leans towards orange and a yellow that leans towards blue or green. And I have a red that leans towards orange and a red that leans towards violet and a blue that leans towards green and a blue that leans towards violet. You'll notice I'm not using that warmer, cooler terminology, and the reason is that makes perfect sense if you're sitting at yellow or red. So if I talk about a warmer yellow, it makes sense to people that I mean the orangey one because I'm headed towards red, which is another warm color, and similarly with red. But if I'm sitting here at blue and I move towards the greenish blues, I'm headed towards yellow, which is a warm color. So maybe the greenish blues should be the warm blues. On the other hand, if I'm sitting here at blue and I move towards the purplish blues, I'm moving towards red, which we think of as a warm color. So maybe the purplish blues should be warmer blues. So if you're one of those people that's been kicking yourself because you can't ever remember which blues are the warm blues and which blues are the cool blues, it's not you. That's bad terminology for blues. And there's no consistency. You'll hear people using both, calling the purplish blues the warmer ones and the greenish blues the warmer ones. And it's because it doesn't make intuitive sense. In both cases, you're moving towards a color that we think of as a warmer color. So I try really hard to talk about blues that lean towards green and blues that lean towards violet instead of warmer and cooler blues. So anyway, that's an aside. So back to our split primary palette. The rationale behind this as a limited palette is if you look at the secondary colors that we can mix, you'll see that they're somewhat brighter on this split primary palette than they are on the primary palette. And that's just because if we start with pigments that already lean towards the secondary that we're trying to mix, we're more likely to get a nice bright, pure secondary color. So if this is your limited palette, if these are all the colors that you're going to have available to you, it makes sense to give yourself as many options as possible for being able to mix bright, pure secondaries. But the idea behind a base palette is not that it's going to do everything. The idea behind a base palette is to quickly get to the colors that you mix 80 or 90% of the time. So if I'm a landscape painter, I'm more often going to be using these more natural looking greens than these really bright, unnatural looking greens. So why not start from something that gets me there quicker, and then if I need a really bright, intense green for something, I can bring that in as one of my spice colors. So I'm sure that some of you are thinking to yourselves at this point, well, you know, this is 6 colors, that's 3 colors, it's not that much of a difference, you know, why not add those 3 more colors, start from the split primary palette, and build my base palette from there instead of starting from this primary palette, and then I can still have all of these options, kind of have the best of both worlds. So let me see if I can convince you that that's actually a bad idea. When you are learning color mixing with a color wheel like this, of course, this isn't the whole story about what you mix between this red and this blue. And in fact, a very common exercise is to have you take your red and your blue, any 2 colors that you're working with on your palette, and kind of explore all the variations of the combinations of those 2 colors. So you kind of look at sort of the full strength, really strong combinations of those 2 and the little bit paler versions, and kind of make a grid that gives you an idea of the whole range. And so this is just exploring 2 colors. So for every pair of colors on your palette, you kind of need to absorb all of this, either by doing this exercise or just through experience. So if you have 3 colors on your palette, there are 3 pages that you need to make like this of 2-way combinations. So you make one for red and blue, you make one for red and yellow, you make one for yellow and blue, and then you have all the 2-way combinations for your colors. And then you do, in watercolor, also want to consider 3-way combinations, because that's how we neutralize our colors, right? We start with these 2, and then we're mixing all of this stuff, but if we need to mute these colors or neutralize them, we're going to have to involve this 3rd color over here. So to understand why 6 colors might be a little bit more of a problem to learn than it seems, let's go back to our 3-color wheel first and think about this little exercise that a lot of times people do to explore the 2-color combinations. And think what it would take to sort of do the same kind of exploration for 3 colors. So what we've done here is we've kind of got, on this axis, we've got how much red or blue are we going to put in. So this is from a lot of red or all red to all blue, and then various proportions in between. And then on this axis, we've got how strong are we going to make it? Is it going to be full strength or really pale? So with this kind of a grid, we can pretty well encapsulate the various combinations and what they look like. Now let's suppose we wanted to have the same kind of 6 divisions and get an understanding of all the different ways that yellow could get involved here. We would actually have to have a separate page for each strength of yellow that we want to add. So we'd have to have a page that would be just like this, except we would add a full strength yellow to every one of these squares. And then we would have to have another page like this, except we would add this strength of yellow to every one of these squares. And then another page just like this, except we would add this strength of yellow to. So we'd wind up with 6 pages like this to just explore the 3-way combinations. So exploring a 3-way combination, you actually add another dimension. So instead of a 6x6 grid, you essentially need a 6x6x6 cube, And we would have to do it on separate pages since we are painting on a flat surface. So exploring the three-way combinations, people don't necessarily do that as an exercise, but your brain has to absorb that information. So that gives you an idea of how much information there is for you to kind of get your head around when you do the three-way combinations. So the three-way combinations are actually tougher than the two-way combinations. So keep that in mind because there's another wrinkle. So to explore our primary palette of 3 colors, we had to look at 3 two-color combinations and 1 3-color combination. And we saw that exploring or understanding that 3-color combination involves a lot more information than each of the 2-color combinations. For the split primary palette, with 6 colors, there are 15 two-color combinations and 20 3-color combinations. So we haven't just doubled it, it's gone up quite a lot. If you bought one of those 12-color travel sets, which seems like a pretty limited palette, there are 66 two-color combos and 220 3-color combos. It's not unusual to find travel sets with 24 colors. And if you have 24 colors, there are 276 two-color combos and 2,024 3-color combos. It's not uncommon for me to give that list of 5 colors that I recommend for Watercolor Jumpstart to a student and have them come back later and say, you know, I went online to buy those and I figured out that for about the same price, I could get this cool 48 color pan set. And look at this, I've got 48 colors. What a deal. Is it any wonder that people think that color mixing is horribly complicated? If you have 48 colors, especially as you're just getting started, it is horribly complicated. So don't fall into that trap. Don't do that to yourself. So I don't want you to think I'm scolding you if you fell for that. I did too. The people who market art supplies know that color is a big motivator for us. And seeing those 48 colors laid out all beautifully in rainbow order gets us excited and makes us want to paint and makes us want to buy art supplies. I'm also not saying you wasted your money if you bought something like that. It means you have lots of options for spice colors and joy colors. And in fact, that's a really great way to get those spice colors and joy colors because you don't use a whole lot of them. So why not have, small amounts of many different colors that you can bring in? I'm just saying that that's not what you want as your whole base palette or just your palette. So most of the time when people are making recommendations, in fact, all of the time that I'm aware of, when people recommend, here's what you should have on your palette, they're thinking, these are all the colors that you're ever going to use. And so, of course, it makes sense to put a high priority on, let's find a collection of colors that gives you as many options as possible. In many cases, we let the physical palette decide for us how many colors. So if I have 28 wells on my palette, there's going to be 28 colors in my palette. If I have 48 little half pans, then my palette has 48 colors. What we're trying to do with a base palette is different. We're trying to identify these 5 to 9 colors that we use over and over again, or that we can use over and over again, to quickly and easily get to the colors that we have to mix all the time. So our priority is ease of mixing the colors that we have to mix over and over and over, not the most possible options. This is why I suggest that it's not a good idea to say, well, I'll just substitute that split primary palette for my primary palette, and then I'll have more options. You have the options. You have as many tubes of color as are in your studio as your spice colors, and so you're not giving anything up by making your base palette small. What you're doing is allowing yourself to not have to think very hard about how to mix colors most of the time. And then when you bring in 1 or 2 extras to combine with that base palette, you only have to get your head around how does this extra color behave with the colors that I already know really well. So it speeds up your learning, it speeds up your mixing, it means you don't have to think as much about that, and you can put your attention on other parts of dealing with whatever you're doing in your painting. So our goal is efficiency in mixing. So if you started with a split primary palette and you already know your particular palette really well and you feel like, well, I don't have to think about mixing my colors anyway, then I'm not really making this video for you. This is really for those people who feel like color mixing is a mystery and they just don't seem to be able to get their heads around it. So we've talked about this primary palette that is the starting point for my base palette in Watercolor Jumpstart. So let's talk about why are there 5 colors instead of 3 in the base palette for Watercolor Jumpstart? Why didn't I've just been making a case for don't add stuff if you don't need it. And so I want to explain why I added colors to this base palette. One thing that's difficult to mix from a primary palette is a nice neutral gray. So if you're trying to mix gray from this, you have to come up with a balance of all 3 primaries. And if you don't get them equally balanced, you'll have a reddish gray or a bluish gray or a greenish gray. And it's hard sometimes to get it to be exactly in the center and neutral. These particular 3 primaries are also difficult to get really dark colors with because they all have sort of a medium level of tinting strength. So what I did was I added 2 more pigments to the Watercolor Jumpstart base palette, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And the reason I added them is this lower curve on this color wheel. That gives me a whole range of browns to warm grays to neutral grays to cool grays to grayed blues. And these are colors that are difficult to mix with this palette. So I wanted my students to be able to quickly mix grays of all sorts and get something that's almost black very easily, and that's difficult with just these 3 pigments. So this Watercolor Jumpstart base palette is sort of a generic all-purpose base palette. If you have no idea where to start, this is not a bad place to start. If you're a beginner and you haven't bought any supplies or you just have a few supplies, this is not a bad place to start. If you've already bought a set of watercolors, then you might see if you can start with the closest approximation to the colors that are shown here, maybe only buy 1 or 2 new colors to get to something sort of like this. But if you've been painting for a while, you probably have more information about your favorite subjects or pigments that you know you gravitate towards that beginners might not know yet. So if you're not a beginner, you might decide to start in a little bit different way constructing your base palette. So let's look at some of those possibilities. So this is actually not a bad starting place for a base primary palette if you happen to paint primarily landscapes, as I do. So you might be looking at this going, well, that's not very colorful, and it doesn't even have any real red on it. Burnt sienna, which is sort of a grayed orange, is playing the role of red in this palette. But if you look at this color wheel next to this color wheel and just glance at them and ask yourself which one feels more like a landscape, it's this one. When I'm painting landscapes, I might occasionally have a red barn or something in there or some bright colored flowers, but the colors that I have to mix 80 to 90% of the time are all over here. So this is actually the starting point for a better base palette for me, especially for something like a field painting kit, because this is going to be the one that I don't have to think very much to mix colors, for example, over in this range. Look at all these golden browns that you do mix very often with landscape painting, but in order to get them from over here, I have to start from an orange and then quiet it down a little bit by adding the complements, so I'm going to involve all 3 colors, whereas over here it's just a mix of 2 colors. I can get to it very quickly. Same with the grays, just like in Jumpstart, I have to mix a lot of grays when I'm doing landscape and a lot of sort of grayed browns to warm browns. Here they're a mix of 2 colors. Over here I have to involve all 3 colors to get to these grayed browns, and even the greens. The greens on this one aren't bad for landscape. They're more natural looking than if I had, say, phthalo blue here. But here, they're even more natural looking, and there's a more gentle gradation between the yellow and the blue. It's easier to land where I want to land here, and even wander over into, oh, the trees are starting to turn into fall colors. So this is a good illustration of how that shift in mentality can actually make it easier for you to mix colors. Instead of trying to give ourselves all the options we can have with 3 colors, what we're doing is saying, let's pick 3 colors that we don't have to think to get 80 to 90% of the colors that we want to mix. So this is actually a pretty good starting place for me for my beginnings of my base palette, because this is 80 to 90% of the colors I need to mix. So what about the rest of the colors that I'd like to have available to me? Well, maybe I do want some brighter reds and pinks especially. I like to have like a pink in the pre-dawn sky. So what I do is I start auditioning other colors to add to my base palette. And so, for example, let's suppose I think maybe I'll add that permanent rose that's available to me on the Jumpstart palette to this one. So I start by just doing some very quick swatching and seeing if this seems like a ballpark candidate, and it certainly does. It seems to give me a lot of the colors that I feel like I'm missing here, sort of a red rock color for the desert southwest, pale pinks and violets for sunrises, and some sunset colors as well. So this looks like a good candidate for adding to my palette. Now, of course, I'd explore it much more thoroughly than this before I made a final decision, but ultimately what I usually do is I stick it on there and I paint with it for a while, and I see if I feel like it's doing its job and am I using it often enough. So even if I love these colors and think, oh, these are fabulous, but it turns out I almost never go into this color when I'm actually painting, then if that's the case, it's probably better used as a spice color. But in fact, I do find I do a lot of sunrise and sunset sort of paintings, so I do find I use this color a lot. So okay, that gets added, and now I have 4 colors. Now one thing that's important about what I've done here is I'm still trying to extend the idea of making most of my colors with a 2-color mix instead of having to involve all 3. So as long as I can do that to the greatest extent possible, I reduce the amount of thinking that I have to do when I'm mixing. I can always throw in that 3rd color if I want to gray things down a little bit. But as I'm looking for things to add, I'm always thinking about, does this quickly get me where I want to go? If I find myself struggling to land on the colors that I feel like I want to be able to use in my paintings, then that's maybe not a good candidate. And then, of course, there has to be turquoise in my life. So this is one of my joy colors. I love cobalt turquoise, cobalt teal, and I actually do use it a fair amount because it's good for little turquoisey highlights in water. I can use it to get some of those more intense greens if I need to. I love the sort of grayed violets that it produces, and also these interesting browns that are in this mixture. And again, this is just very quick swatching to get a rough idea of, do I think it works for me? But once I've come up with something that I think, you know what, this looks like it's going to give me 80 to 90% of what I tried to mix, then the next step is to say, all right, I'm going to set that up as a base palette and work with it for a while. Because the real test is, how does it work in practice? Do I really go into all these colors a lot? Do I find that I'm mixing things without having to think very much? Or am I struggling? And if I'm struggling, then maybe that means I'm going to swap something out. Let's look at starting from some other starting places just to give you some other ideas to kind of expand your direction. Maybe you're not primarily a landscape painter. So let's go back to look at this one. Here's one that I think is a really fun, could be just a really fun base palette more or less by itself if you do mostly sort of tropical themed things. It feels very colorful, even though there's no intense yellow. And if you feel like you do need those bright yellows and bright yellow greens, then adding one bright yellow to this might be a good possibility. So here's an example of quickly swatching in a more bright yellow. And again, what you want to do is audition that color with the rest of your colors by putting it on your palette for a while and seeing how often do I really use that. Is it really part of my base palette, or is it a spice color? Or maybe it's a joy color and it's on my base palette whether I use it a lot or not because I just love that color and when I need it, I really need it. So the thing to do is kind of just glance at this and don't ask yourself, don't go in and analyze what colors can I mix and what colors can't I mix. Ask yourself, does this kind of have the overall feel I want my paintings to have? Does this make me happy? Does this look like me? And if it does, then it's a good place to start with a base palette. So one more example. This one is going to look kind of dull and boring compared to the ones that we've just looked at, because again, when we look at a color wheel in the abstract, we all get jazzed when we see lots of, bright kindergarten colors, but that's not actually what necessarily works for paintings to hang in people's actual homes or offices. So this is more of a muted palette that works really well, or has worked really well for me in corporate settings. So when interior designers design the colors for an office building, a healthcare setting, they tend to go with colors that are a little bit more muted because it's easier to combine fabrics and carpeting and paint swatches if they're not too intense, and it's a bit more restful to the eye. And so having these as my base palette might give me a lot of those neutralized colors that blend in fairly well with the decor. And then I add a few bright pops of color to make the artwork stand out off the wall and, really kind of grab your attention. But because it's surrounded by these more muted colors, I actually get two benefits. It fits better into the decor. It's easier for the designer to go, yeah, that'll work in our waiting room. And also, because I have mostly muted colors in my painting, when I do use a bright color, it seems even more intense by comparison. So this is sort of the setting that sets off the jewel. So very often, when you're using the base palette mentality, you wind up with a base palette that might, as a color wheel, look a little bit on the boring side. And that's okay. In fact, that's a good thing because, again, in most paintings and in most of the real world, most of the colors that you see are a bit neutralized. So if I can get them quickly by mixing only two colors, instead of having to try to do all three or get some gray in there or whatever to quiet them down, that actually makes it faster for me to mix the colors I need to get in there with my painting and go quickly. And then I'm not cutting myself off from all those bright colors. I can bring them in as I need them. And if there are certain bright colors that are always in my paintings, like turquoise, then I can add a bright turquoise as part of my base palette because I use it a lot. Or I can say, hey, in this particular room, this decor, they're using accent colors of a bright violet. So I could certainly bring that in and it would harmonize just fine with this because these are all neutralized colors. So I know this base palette concept is a little different and it's kind of a lot to absorb and a shift in thinking. And we're almost out of time for our demos, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up there and go into the question and answer session. But before I do that, I do want to address one question that I know is on a lot of people's minds, and that is, what about the actual physical palette that we're going to put these colors on? And I've purposely not talked about that very much because, as I mentioned before, a lot of times we let that physical item determine for us how many colors we're going to put out and sort of have staring us in the face on an everyday basis. Now, once you have your base palette established and you know it really well, it doesn't seem to really cause a problem to have a lot of other colors that you use frequently as spice colors or joy colors, and you still will gravitate to your base palette because you know it really well. But until you know it really well, having lots and lots of things out there sort of staring you in the face can drag you back into that mentality of, I'm going to try to find the pigment that is the closest match to the thing I'm looking at. And if you keep doing that, it hinders your ability to learn to mix colors. So if you're just starting out with this base palette idea, a suggestion for you is maybe get yourself an inexpensive small palette that you can set up with just your base palette or just your first guess as your base palette to start out with. And you can still have whatever other palettes you already have in your studio, but use that one to do as much of your painting as you can, and that way you'll have a good idea whether you've chosen a good base palette. Then once you really know those colors well, you will naturally go to them most often, even if there are other colors on your palette. Unfortunately, between the time I made the first demo for this video and when the files got lost, I thought to myself, well, now I've demonstrated everything I want to show people about palette possibilities, and I got rid of all the extra palettes that were in my studio purely for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to show you what I'm actually using right now because I think it's a really good option for kind of what to do if you want a palette that gives you lots of possibilities. But I'm also going to mention sort of some pros and cons of other common options. Unfortunately, I can't show them to you, so I'm going to leave it to you to Google it and look at pictures yourself online. Let me start off with what I suggest you do if you are just getting started with this base palette idea, and whether you're a beginner and you're buying your first palette, or you're more advanced and you just need to have like that more isolated palette to help yourself get started with this base palette idea. So before I start talking about this palette, I want to mention one of the options that I actually can't show you, but I won't need to. You'll know exactly what I mean. If you're looking for a really great, inexpensive option, either for a travel palette or for a place to kind of hold some colors as you're trying to figure out exactly what goes in your base palette, a great option is to go buy the least expensive kids watercolor set you can find. You can often find these for $1 or $2 at like a dollar store or a discount store. And then simply either have your favorite kid use up the colors or rinse them out. It doesn't take much. They're usually not very powerful colors, so it's pretty easy to rinse them out or scrape them out. And then you have a palette that has 8 wells. They typically come with 8 colors. So you have 8 wells. That's a perfect size to keep you from going overboard building your base palette. And then you can put small quantities of paint in there. And when you've got your base palette figured out and you transfer it to whatever palette you're using in your studio, you can actually repurpose that little kid's watercolor palette as a great travel palette. They're lightweight, they carry 8 colors, which is plenty if you've determined a good base palette, and they have kind of a small mixing area, but it's okay for postcards or something like that. So it's also could be your second palette for when you have a friend or a child come over to paint with you. You can give them that and put real watercolors in it so they get the real watercolor experience. So that would be my first suggestion as you're building a base palette is start with one of those, and that way you won't be tempted to put too many colors in your base palette. Another option, if you don't want to go that route, is to buy a palette like this. So I like these palettes for my beginners because they don't have too many wells. There's still 18 wells here, so that's enough to get in trouble, but they're not too crazy. But because of this lift-out mixing surface, you actually have quite a large area to mix colors with. They have a little plastic gasket so that if some of your colors are still wet and you close them up and put them in a bag this way and some color runs, it might make a little bit of a mess inside your palette, but it won't make a big mess inside your backpack or your tote bag. And for many tote bags, you can put this straight down into the bottom. Anything that's like a profile of a grocery bag is about this long and about that wide, so this fits in the bottom flat. So if you're coming and going to actual classes, when we can do that again, this is a great option. So even if you buy it only to figure out your base palette, it becomes a good palette for traveling to classes. And it's not a bad palette as just a general travel palette. It's lightweight. When it's closed, yeah, it's bigger than those little, metal pan palettes, but it's pretty slim profile, and it fits often in the bottom of a backpack or a tote bag. So there are a lot of variations on this theme with different arrangements of the wells and so forth. This one, I think, is made by Alvin. There's also Magello. There are a bunch of others, but what I would do is just search for plastic watercolor palette with gasket. And you'll get a bunch of other things because everybody's going to try and sell you their palette, but you can tell by looking at the picture if they have this little gasket, and they'll also usually put that in the description. So, you can use your own judgment about how you like the wells to be arranged, and I'll show you another version of this in a moment. And then if you're using it to determine a new base palette, you can take one of two approaches. You can just block off most of them and leave yourself only 8 or 9 wells open so you don't get carried away. Or you can say, I'm going to make sure I leave 1 or 2 open wells in between all my colors to add spice colors and joy colors later. Or you can just put out small quantities until you have it figured out and then fill it with the colors that are in your base palette and spice colors and joy colors that you use often. So this is one great option for getting started with that base palette idea. And in fact, there are somewhat bigger versions, and the advantage to the bigger version really to me is not that it has more wells, although it does, but that it has even more mixing surfaces. So in this one, all of this comes apart. So this is more mixing surface than I have ever had on any of my studio palettes in this relatively small and lightweight container. So this has become kind of my go-to. And my big complaint with this palette is when you start painting bigger and you're using bigger brushes, it's hard to get a large flat brush into these wells. So when I found out that, oh, they do make them with palette wells that are wide enough to get my big flat brush in, I bought this palette. The drawback to this one is, I think for most people, when you're working in watercolor and learning color mixing at the beginning, it's easiest if you can arrange your palette in color wheel order. So things go in the same order they'd be on the color wheel. It's easy for you to see what colors are similar and what colors are very different and likely to be complements. And that's I actually have to think a little more about where I'm going with my brush on this palette because it's not in color wheel order. But for me, because I have been traveling and I hope to be traveling again, the combination of a really compact palette that has lots and lots of mixing area that I can kind of keep expanding was a good trade-off. Now, if you have a larger studio space, you might prefer one of the more traditional watercolor palettes. So this is an example of what would be considered a more traditional watercolor palette. And some features that I think that are nice to look for in a palette like this is if it's a plastic palette, look for high impact plastic or heavy duty plastic. They'll last a lot longer. Look for a cover. This one has a cover with a gasket like the previous one, so it's good for carrying things back and forth. This particular palette was sold as the Cheap Joe's Workhorse Traditional Palette and also as the Alvin Heavy Duty 21 Well Palette. It seems to be hard to come by these days, so it's not so important to worry about the particular one, but those are some nice features that it had that you might want to look at. Now, all plastic watercolor palettes will stain. So if that really bugs you, you can consider a porcelain palette. So this one in this clip from my Skies and Clouds course is a Stephen Quiller porcelain palette. There are also rectangular versions if you prefer that arrangement. But the main reason I wanted to show this one is not because it's porcelain. Porcelain palettes are nice, but they're heavy and expensive, and you can break them, as I did break this one. But the main reason I wanted to show you this is because of that circular arrangement of the palette wells. If you're having a hard time getting your head around what's the complement of what, or how does the color wheel really work, having a palette laid out like this can be very helpful. So there are also plastic Stephen Quiller palettes, which are quite a bit less expensive. There's a larger one and a smaller one. So if you're looking for that, and I believe there are some other brands now that are arranged this way too. So there's a roundup of some of the things you might want to think about when you're selecting a physical palette. I'm not going to go into any more detail. If you take any one watercolor item, you could probably spend an entire day just talking about all the possibilities. So I'm going to leave it to you to research physical palettes. It's really personal preference. And hopefully this gives you some idea of what features to look for that might be nice to have. I'm not going to discuss travel palettes at all because I talked about that in my Second Sunday Live demo for March 2019, where I talked about what's in my field sketch kit. So if you're interested in that aspect, I'll refer you to that demo. So it's time for the question and answer roundup. And what I do here is, instead of recording the live question and answers where other people might be seen on screen, I've gathered together all the questions, and I'm going to tell you what the questions were and then give you my answers. Our first question is, what brand of watercolors do you use? Your colors are so much brighter than mine. I want to buy the same brand you're using. So I use 8 or 9 different brands of watercolor paint. They're all commonly known brands. There's nothing special or magic about the paint that I'm using. This is what I'm talking about when I say don't believe what you're seeing on your computer monitor. So on the left you see paints under normal lighting that are dry. On the right you see paints under my super bright video lights that I've already reactivated with water. That's most of the difference that you're seeing between your paints and my paints. Next question, how do you keep track of the colors on your palette? So my favorite way to do this is to make a little diagram in my studio notebook. So I have a sketchbook in my studio that I don't use just for everyday sketching. I use this as a place to keep records and think through problems and plan paintings I'm working on, keep track of projects. It's my problem solving and record keeping notebook for the studio. So that's a good place for me to go and find this information and know where it always is. So what I've done is I've drawn a little diagram of this is my travel palette here, and I've just used the colors to sort of swatch their location. And then since this one's a little small, I swatched them over here and wrote the manufacturer, the color name, and the pigment on the swatches. And then you can see I was doing some playing around with some of the ones that were on here kind of as candidates for maybe being added or spice colors that I might use. So I want to point something out about this palette because this question comes up fairly often. People will say to me, well, you talk about having 8 or 9 colors on your base palette, but you've got way more colors than that there. And that's true. And that's one reason why I don't list the colors of my palette. So on this palette are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 colors that are my base palette. And then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors that are the Watercolor Jumpstart base palette. So there's one color in together, or 2 colors together there, so 5 plus 8, 13, that's 11 colors. The remaining 5 colors on here are a couple of spice colors that I was using for a project I was working on, and all 3 of these were colors that I was sort of testing out, trying to decide, did I want them in for an upcoming project or not. So this one got X'd out. This is going to be the spice color for an upcoming project. And this is a color that's new to me, and I'm just trying it out to see what I think of it. So there really is just a base palette of 8 colors. It's just that on all of my palettes, I have colors there that are there for other reasons. Now, you won't have to have 2 base palettes unless you're also teaching classes where you have a different base palette. So you might be able to get away with just the 12 colors that normally come on one of these pans, which makes your life a lot easier. That still gives you room for 8 or 9 in your base palette, and 3 or 4 that are spice colors or being auditioned or whatever it might be. And a nice thing about these travel palettes is these little half pans come out, and so I can swap colors out pretty easily. So this is a good place for me to try out colors. And if you happen to have one of those little 48 color palettes, then that's a good place for you to try out colors. You can move them around and kind of keep your base palette all over on one side, or you can mark it with a Sharpie so you know where it is. So something I want to emphasize while we're looking at these reference swatches is that it's important to write down the manufacturer, the color name, and you might also want to write down the pigment code or pigment codes that are in that particular paint. Those are usually printed in teeny weeny print on the side of the tube, or you may have to look them up in the manufacturer's color chart. So let me explain why I go to that trouble. Here's an example of 3 different paints that are all given the name quinacridone gold. And they're 3 different brands. And you can see that they're pretty similar, but there are some differences. This one's a little bit more on the brown side. This one's got a bit of an orangey tone, and this one is a little bit more of a golden brown. And maybe that doesn't matter to you, but sometimes it really matters to me. So I want to be sure that when I buy a tube of paint to replace the one that I've been using, that I have the same color, especially if I run out in the middle of a painting. I don't want to switch colors in the middle of a painting. So in the case of this quinacridone gold, true quinacridone gold pigment isn't on the market anymore, so if you find a tube that says PO49, you're lucky you got one of the remaining old ones from years ago when that pigment was being manufactured. So currently, manufacturers try to do their best to match their old version of quinacridone gold, which wasn't necessarily the same from one to the next anyway. So you need to write down the name of the manufacturer and their name for the color, which might be totally different from somebody else's name for the very same pigment. And the pigment or pigments in the paint formula, because different manufacturers might use different pigments or different combinations to reproduce a color that's no longer made, or that's toxic and they don't carry it, or that isn't light fast. But also, don't assume that just because you wrote down the pigment code that you can just buy another brand with that same pigment code and have the same color. Because even with, this is the same manufacturer in both cases, it's actually the same pigment code in both cases, but they are very different colors. This is cobalt blue, this is cobalt teal. So even if the pigment code is the same, the way the paint is formulated can affect what hue it takes on. So you need all 3 pieces of information: the manufacturer's name, their name for the color, and the pigment code or pigment codes. And that's the only way you can be sure that when you buy the next tube of paint, you're going to get the same color. And it's very aggravating to run out halfway through a painting and go to buy a replacement and oops, I bought the same color name, but it looks completely different. Or I thought I was buying the same pigment, but it looks completely different. So you need all 3 pieces of information to be sure that you're getting the same thing. Next question, what if I put color in the wrong place when I'm setting up my palette? It happens to all of us, no matter how hard you try to set up your palette exactly the way you want it. At some point you realize, oh, I need to move this color over here to make room for another in between so I can keep my colors in rainbow order. Or, you know what, I really don't want that color on my palette, I want to substitute something else and I need to make room for it. So when you need to move color on your palette to a different well or off your palette entirely, a handy little tool to have is something like this. This is called a color shaper, and it's sold for manipulating acrylic paint, but it's a little silicone rubber spatula. Or depending on the size of your palette, you might be able to just use a little silicone rubber spatula. And the silicone rubber is nice because it allows you to get down in all the little corners and really get all the paint out of there, but it doesn't scratch your plastic palette. Now, if your paint has been dried for a while on the palette, some pigments will sort of hold together, and you can just gently pry that whole chunk of paint out of there with a butter knife. Other pigments will sort of fragment or be kind of a gummy mess, and you can't do that as easily. So if you're trying to remove dried paint and you're having a hard time scooping it out because it's so dry, add enough water to completely cover the paint, rest your palette closed on a heating pad for half an hour or so. Gum arabic will soften more easily with heat, so adding that heating pad can speed up the process or make it work when it doesn't want to work at all. And then you might have to get in there and agitate the surface depending on how dry the paint is, add a little bit more water and repeat. But you should be able to fairly easily get that paint to sort of liquefy or soften up back to a tube consistency or maybe a little bit more liquid. If you have to get it really liquid, then you might let it sit for a little while and try to get it back towards that tube consistency. And then what do you do with that paint if you're not going to just move it to another well on your palette? Suppose you've decided that color is coming off your palette because you only use it occasionally, but you don't want to throw it away. Well, you can buy little plastic containers for it if you want to, but an easy solution is to just take a little square of aluminum foil and scoop the paint out, put it into your square of aluminum foil, and then fold up your aluminum foil carefully. If your paint's really liquid, you might want to let it dry a little bit before you fold up your aluminum foil. I try to do it so I have a little slack. I'm not smushing the paint. It's got a little bit of breathing room, but not too much. I don't want a whole lot of air in there because then the paint won't stay soft. So then I can either put a piece of masking tape on it or write on here with a Sharpie. Again, I write the manufacturer's name, the color name, and the pigment. And you can store it like this for a long, long time. I worried initially that maybe some of the pigments would react with the metal, and then I realized most paint tubes are made out of aluminum. So they're basically aluminum foil, they're just a little heavier. I haven't had any problems with using this aluminum foil method. It's a very compact storage method, unlike the plastic containers. And when you want to get it back out of there, it's really easy to scrape it back out and put it back on a palette. Or if you only use it occasionally, you can open up your aluminum foil, use whatever you need, and then let it dry and fold it back up again and put it back in storage. Okay, next question. What if I'm searching for a particular color, a particular hue, and I can't tell enough from the color charts? How do I avoid wasting a lot of money buying paint that I don't actually use? So some manufacturers make what they call dot charts, and some of them, they used to offer them for free. I think most of them actually charge for them now, which isn't surprising. So the first thing to do would be to check the manufacturers that you're considering and see if they offer a dot chart. So dot chart is just where they send you a chart of paper, and of course theirs would be printed with all the different color names, but basically you have a lot of dots where it's like somebody just took the tube of paint and pressed it down and gave you a little blob of color. And that's enough color for you to be able to come in and swatch it out and get an idea of what that color looks like. This is the best way to really see if you're going to like a color. And there's usually enough there to also try mixing it with other colors that you have. Now, if your manufacturer or the one that you're considering for the color that you're trying to buy doesn't make a dot chart, and you belong to any kind of artist group at all, so if you're on our Discord channel, you belong to a Facebook group or some other kind of artist group, you have friends who paint in watercolor, Ask your friends. Tell them, I'm looking for a particular yellow. I've tried this one, this one, this one, and they're close, but not, exactly what I'm looking for. Do you have any suggestions? And ask them if they'll send you a little dot in the mail. So if you squeeze the tube like I did, make that little dot, and then let it dry overnight so it's not too sticky. And I usually fold it in half because sometimes it will be a little sticky. Pop it in an envelope, stick it in the mail. Oh, and label it. Do your friend a favor, label it. Watercolorists seem to be enormously generous people, so ask each other to share a tiny little dot of color. And of course, when we can meet again in person, it's great to just have a day where you get together with your friends and you all bring your 200 tubes of color that you bought trying to find the right color and have a swap day. You may find exactly the color you're looking for and feel good about being able to swap colors instead of, have them sit in a drawer and not be used. Next question, or series of questions. Why do you hate Payne's Gray or Phthalo Blue or Phthalo Green or Tube Greens? So this is actually a myth. I don't hate any of those colors. In fact, I don't think there is a color I hate. I do tend to steer beginners away from all of those colors, and the reason is that they can all create problems if you're not careful with how you handle them. So Payne's Gray contains Phthalo Blue, and the issue with the Payne's Gray, I think I talked before about how if you use the same gray everywhere, you get sort of this overall monotonous, everything feels a little gray, and I find that less appealing than mixing a variety of grays. And I think many people struggle with their painting looks kind of dull and boring because they have too much of the same gray everywhere when they use Payne's Gray. Phthalo Blue, Phthalo Green, and Tube Greens, which contain Phthalo Green, which are the ones that I warn people about, are simply very powerful colors. They're those colors that have that really strong tinting strength. So when somebody is coming to me saying, I'm struggling mixing color, I know that those colors might create problems for them. So I'm not saying don't use them. I'm saying if you're struggling, don't start with those. And I'm not even saying don't use Payne's Gray. There are times where it's a legitimate thing to use. I'm just saying that if you're feeling like your paintings have this sort of dull sameness and aren't lively, and you're using a lot of Payne's Gray, mixing your own grays can bring some life back to things. So the next question, you haven't said anything yet about student grade paints. If I bought a bunch of student grade paints, should I just throw them away or give them away? No, you can actually use your student grade paints. The main difference between student grade, or it's sometimes called academy grade, and artist grade or professional grade paints is to keep the costs down for student paints, they don't put as much pigment in them. So you're paying for pigment primarily when you buy artist quality paints. And so they're actually not more expensive over the long run because you use less of them to get the same strength of color in your wash. But if you're just starting out in watercolor and you don't know if you're going to stick with it, then it makes sense to try those student grade paints, and so what if you use more of them up if you only get to half a tube before you decide, well, watercolor's not for me. If you have decided watercolor is for you and you have a bunch of student grade paints, what you can do is just start replacing them with artist grade paints as you run out, or replace first those colors that you find you just can't seem to get a strong enough or intense enough color. So if you've been mixing and mixing and you just feel like I can never get my colors intense enough or bright enough, and you're using student grade paints, that could be part of the reason. Another way that they try to keep the costs down for student grade paints is they sometimes make substitutions for the really expensive pigments. So for example, the cobalt pigments tend to be expensive. So if you buy a student grade cobalt blue paint, it might say cobalt blue hue. And what that means is they've made the color of cobalt blue, the hue of cobalt blue, using other pigments, or maybe using a little cobalt blue and some other pigments to kind of make up, because cobalt blue is expensive. So there's pros and cons to that, actually. So if you If you like the granulation of cobalt blue, then a cobalt blue hue might or might not actually show that granulation. So if you're not getting granulation and you want it, then you might go, well, I've got to upgrade to the artist grade paint for my cobalt blue. On the other hand, if you really like that color, but you don't care for granulation and you're looking for a substitute, instead of searching around for another artist grade paint that is a good color match for cobalt blue, let the manufacturer do it for you and buy a cobalt blue hue that's actually been color matched, at the factory, and they've done all the work of figuring out how to adjust it, and see if you can find one that doesn't produce granulation. So student grade paints are fine. You can mix them with your artist grade paint, and if you have a bunch of them, I would say use them when you need a paler color, or use them when you don't need those special properties of the more expensive pigments or don't want those, and go ahead and use them up. Or, if you don't like them and you feel like you want to just switch, then certainly, there will be someone else who's interested in trying watercolor that you can give them to with not a guilty conscience. You're not giving them junk. You're just giving them something that's not quite as strong. And you might tell them that so they know that it's not them if they can't get the same intense color you're getting. What if you open a tube of paint and a bunch of goop runs out but no color? So that goop is the gum arabic, which is binder in watercolor paint. And some pigments are kind of heavy and they want to settle out from the gum arabic mixture. And many displays for watercolor paint either have that tube hanging by the cap or sitting upright in little bins. So over time, those heavier pigments will settle to the bottom of the tube. Sometimes you can sort of remix them by squishing the tube around before you open it, but that has its own risks because then sometimes the paint's under pressure and when you take the cap off it goes everywhere. So I recommend you just kind of don't worry about it too much, live with it. If you're putting it into a paint well and you get some gum arabic first, just keep squeezing until you get plenty of color and remix it. There's usually plenty of gum arabic in the tube, so if you open it and some goes where you didn't want it and you lose a little bit, that's usually not an issue. But if you feel like, gosh, that was half the tube and I really should add some more gum arabic when I get down to the color, you can buy gum arabic already mixed up to the right consistency for watercolor paint in little bottles from watercolor paint manufacturers. You can also buy it online as a powder and mix up your own, but I don't recommend doing that unless you're like, I would do that for my entire class and make enough for everybody. But it's kind of a fussy process to melt it, get it at the right consistency, add preservatives so it doesn't go bad, find little bottles to put it in, etc. This little bottle will probably last you your entire watercolor career, so I recommend you just buy a bottle online. And then if you do have a bunch goop out, it's not a disaster, it's just a minor annoyance. What about stuck caps? So it seems like the universal reaction to a stuck watercolor cap is to pull out the pliers and start cranking. And that's risky because the way these caps are constructed, if you squeeze the outer part of this cap too hard, this whole center disc can pop out. And that's not a good situation because now you have no way to close that tube anymore. A better method than the brute force and ignorance method is to say, okay, the binder in watercolor paint is gum arabic. Gum arabic remains soluble in water forever. It never dries so that you can't redissolve it. But it does take a little bit to redissolve, and warm water helps. So the easy way to deal with a stuck cap is to put just enough warm water in a little cup, and I use whatever is the hottest temperature I can get out of my tap. And then you put the tube in, and what you want is the water to be just deep enough to cover the bottom part, or the cap itself, and the bottom part of the tube, or the top part, as the case might be. Some labels will come off if you soak them for a while, so don't soak the whole tube. Just soak this part. You only need to get to the water in here. Give it 2 minutes, and I have never had one that you couldn't just open right away after 2 minutes in hot water. So a little bit of patience, a little hot water, will solve the problem without any struggle and without the risk of destroying the cap. Next question, can you mix different brands of watercolor paint, or do you need to stick with just one? You can mix them all you want. I use 8 or 9 different brands. The main difference between different brands of watercolor paint is they all have their own color lines. So you may find colors that you like in one brand that just aren't available in other brands, or perhaps you like the particular formulation they use for one of their mixed colors. So something like Hooker's Green, for example, is going to be different across brands because they'll decide how they want to formulate it. We talked about that Quinn Gold example earlier. So I look for the hue that I like and the handling properties that I like, and I don't worry too much about the brand. Brands also do tend to target sort of general handling properties, so some of them will make a paint that's a little stiffer paint, and some will have a little bit runnier, softer paint. Some add honey to help keep the paint soft in the palette. That's a matter of personal preference, whether you like it that way or not. And then some will do things to, say, promote granulation because that's the market that they're targeting. So there are some differences, but they aren't differences that matter in terms of being able to mix the paints or use them with each other. Can you use watercolor paint that has dried out, or should you throw it away? So you can definitely use it. Watercolor paint doesn't ever dry to the point where it can't be reconstituted with water. As we talked about back when we were talking about moving colors around on your palette, sometimes you need to add some water, let it sit with a gentle heat source like a heating pad, stir it some, add a little bit more water, let it sit on the heat. If it's been really dried up and it's one of those paints that fragments and sort of makes little crunchy bits, it might take a little work to get it reconstituted. So you might have to be patient and keep using that warmth and stirring it to make sure you get all the little lumps out of there. But you definitely can reconstitute it no matter how long it's been dried up. If it's dried up in the tube and you can't squeeze it out, those tubes are basically heavy aluminum foils, so you can take a pair of scissors and cut the back end off the tube and then kind of cut a slit down the side and empty that color out into another container to reconstitute it, and then kind of rinse the inside of the tube with water. So you definitely can rehabilitate even tubes of paint that have been dried up for 30 years and still use that paint, and it'll be perfectly fine. Next question, do you prefer or recommend single pigment paints? Why? I don't recommend them. I did notice when I was thinking about this question that I seem to have more single pigment paints on my palette than mixtures, but that might be mostly because many of the mixtures are tube greens, which I kind of prefer not to use. Or it could just be that single pigment paints are more common. I'm not really sure. I don't choose them for that particular reason. I choose the colors that I like that allow me to mix the colors I want to mix and work well together on my palette, and I don't really worry about whether they're single pigment paints or not. What if you don't like to let your paints dry out in your palette? Well, I'm one of those people. I like to use my paints kind of at tube consistency, and that's one reason why I do like these palettes that have the gasket around the edge to kind of seal the cover. So these paints, I haven't painted with them for a few days now, and you can see they're still pretty moist. And then when I open my palette up, I either mist my colors like this, or if I'm only going to use a few colors, I may just take a brush and use it like an eyedropper to activate those colors. And then sometimes before I close the palette, if I've been painting a long time and colors are looking a little dry, I might mist it again before I close it up. If you have a palette with a large center mixing area and a lid that maybe doesn't have a gasket, you can put a damp sponge in there. One thing to be aware of is that if you keep your paints moist all the time, you may encounter mold on your palette. And this isn't because of the water that you're using. Distilled water doesn't help. It's entirely sort of luck of the draw and the environment where you live. The molds that cause the problems on a watercolor palette are common soil organisms, so they're in the dust, in the air, and if one happens to blow in and land in your watercolor paints, then it can start growing there. That can be really aggravating because you'll open it up and there's fuzz all over everything and you think, oh no, my paints are ruined. They're not ruined. It's not that hard to deal with the mold issue, and I made a video about it, so I'm not going to talk about that here because that's going too far afield. But that is the one drawback. Some people will go years and years and years and never have a problem with mold because maybe it's not very prevalent in their environment. Their studio doesn't have a lot of outside dust coming into it or whatever it might be. And others will struggle with it a lot, but the video that I made on it I think has a pretty good solution to take care of it, and you don't have to stress about it if it does happen, and you can get it to the level of a minor nuisance and not a huge disaster. So that's the way I handle keeping my palette moist. The best way to avoid mold is to paint a lot so that you're never leaving some mold spores sitting there for ages to develop and turn into a mess. Okay, next question. What's oxgall and how do you use it? So oxgall is a paint additive. It's often in some of your paints already, a little bit of it. And the main use for it is to help make the watercolor flow a little bit more. So it's what's called a surfactant or wetting agent. It's kind of like that stuff you put in your dishwasher to keep the glass from being streaky. It makes the water kind of sheet down. And when you add it to your watercolors, it increases the likelihood that they'll spread in a on wet or damp paper. So what I use it principally for is to help make washes that are more even. If I'm working on a big page and I have a pigment that doesn't like to spread evenly, I use the oxgall to promote that spreading. Or if you're trying to get those, you know, big dramatic watercolor feathery effects where you drop in color. So the way to use this is if you're mixing up your wash, let's say you've got 1/4 inch at the bottom of a cup like this, which is quite a lot of wash, you might add 2 or 3 drops of oxgall. That's plenty. You don't need any more than that. Some people just add several drops to their rinse water and or to the water that they're using to mix their washes, but it's a little goes a long way. You don't need a ton of it. More is not necessarily better. So that's oxgall. And that rounds up our questions. Thank you for joining me for this demo or for this reconstructed version of the demo. I hope you found some of this useful. We got kind of far afield with the questions, so I hope you'll return to that notion of a base palette of just a few colors that you know really well and try and see if you can construct one for yourself and see if it helps you with your color mixing and makes color mixing easier for you. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Happy painting.